So next we have Rachelle Towart, who is the Managing Director of Pipeline Talent. She is recognized nationally in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership, governance and education, and received her Order of the Australian Medal in acknowledgement of her achievements in these areas. I had the privilege of working with Rachelle, who helped BSI Learning facilitate a 12-month Indigenous leadership program in the South Coast for a group of senior executives from local Aboriginal land councils reach their leadership potential. As a former CEO of the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre, she has been recognised with a wide range of awards, namely the prestigious Westpac Community CEO of the Year in 2014, and one of AFR's Australian Women of Influence. Today, she will present her topic on Indigenous women in the workplace and community, and specifically about this year's NAIDOC theme, Heal the Country. Please welcome Rachelle.
I think we should play mute bingo every time somebody speaks with the mute button on, and that's going to be me, so I'll just claim to win. But firstly, thank you, Carla, for the introduction, and I would also like to pay my respect and honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and future. I acknowledge the stories, their tradition, the living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this land, and commit to building a bigger, brighter future. Genuine inclusion must include reconciliation. There can be no genuine workplace inclusion while our First Nations people are excluded from opportunities. And we as a nation do not address race relations, equality, unity, institutional integrity and historical acceptance. So I started this business 5 years ago after being a CEO of a small little RTO called the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre. And I think before I get into the topic of conversation, I just would like to give you a little bit of a history as to why I do what I do. So being the CEO of the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre and creating thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders across the country, I was really nervous about what my next step would be. I knew that I didn't want to stay and take on another contract at the AILC. So back in my earlier career days, I always wanted to be a career public servant. I dreamt of being an SES officer because they got a free car park. I wanted to be at the level that you get a car park. So that's where I thought I would be. But the best career decision that I ever made was to leave the public service, which was nervous and exciting, but absolutely the best decision that I've ever made. In fact, I used to work for Centrelink, and they used to invite me back to speak, but then they stopped because I was saying that the best thing that I ever did was leave. So that was pretty, that's okay. So anyway, I was sitting on a plane ride over to Western Australia where Qantas had done a story of me in their in-flight magazine. Hope there's nobody here from Qantas, but Mr. Joyce sitting in row 30 next to the loo. I'm in your book and there's not even an upgrade, but that's again all cool as well. So reading this article about myself, and I turn the page and there's this story about women in the pipeline and how women's numbers were increasing in corporate, community and government roles. And it got me thinking around, it had all these bubbles of percentages. And I just did a quick recce in my head around, if this is the number for women, what are the numbers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And I did a quick in my head. In the Northern Territory, there were 26 agencies of territory government, not one of them headed by an Aboriginal person. looked at the federal government, and I'd been just offered a job in the federal public service. I would have been number 22 at the band 1 level. And there's lots of different bands that go along with that. There was only 2 band 2s, and the rest were in the band 1 category. No government departments heads. Yes, we had statutory authorities, but there wasn't really a lot or enough of Aboriginal people. So I got off this flight and I rang the minister and said, thanks for your offer. However, I'm going to start my own recruitment business. Now, I don't know if there's any of you that are on the line today that are in recruitment, but it is one of the most, I think, dumbed down industries that's compared to used car salesmen and real estate agents. And I think that has to do with an educational qualification, in that there's no formal tertiary qualification that relates to recruitment. So I had to really unpack, why don't we have Aboriginal people at middle, senior levels of executive? Where do they exist? Why don't they exist? And some of this thing was around that managers and supervisors really don't know how to give this thing called real feedback to their staff. We've never done people leadership training as such. I'd be interested to see how many of you have actually done people leadership training. If there's anything that you could write in your text box, not that I can see it on my screen, but I'm sure that somebody will tell me. Actual learning how to get the best out of your staff. Because for me, it's normally a unit that we do. It might be a unit of competency in a vet qualification. But normally what happens is, if you're a high performer, you get moved on and upwards pretty quickly, and then someone goes, and here's some staff to finish, to train, to get to manage and get the best out of. And people sort of just crumble at the thought around, am I going to do staff management? And then you put the layer on, if I say somebody is not so great at policy, are they going to say that I'm being a racist? Or am I going to say, is this the better, am I just saying if they're shit at policy, they're shit at policy? Is it going to be, am I going to be a racist if I say that? And some of the fear around that is, well, because of all of the IR laws, it doesn't allow you to have those real conversations. So that's one of the things that we've put in place, that we want to see more people leaders created. I think that's probably one of my big things. So starting this recruitment business, I really did have to unpack, why don't we have Aboriginal people in leadership positions? So in the ASX 500, there are 0.02% of C-suite or board members. If we looked at the numbers of, take it back to women and women in the workforce, the last ABS data said that women in the workforce currently 59%, and 51.4% are Aboriginal women, and 65% of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander men are participating in the workforce. So that there's quite a bit of room to move in terms of workforce participation for women. Starting again 4 months into my business, and the reason I say that participation rates are low is I'll share with you a personal story. 4 months into my business, my mother calls me and said, "Hey, Rachelle, you need..." So I turned 50 around Easter, and so I have a 26-year-old daughter. Her birthday's in September, recently married, cool. But 5 years ago when I started this business, 4 months in, I get a phone call from my mum and said, "Rachelle, you need to come and get your brother's baby." And I said, "What baby?" My brother has been a drug addict for many, many years, too many years. Ice is his drug of choice. And so I find myself taking on a 4-month-old baby. It was meant to be for 2 weeks. And then a few months later, we get another phone call from Childcare and Protection. There's another sibling. We needed to take him too. And last year there was a 3rd sibling, but we don't have her yet. So I found myself now with, very successful businesswoman. Yes, I have lots of awards and recognition and all those sorts of things. But when my story of becoming a kinship carer is also one that is very common for Aboriginal women, that grandparents, my mother is lucky that she has me, because I don't know that my mum would be as patient being at 75 and having to look after a now 3 and 4-year-old who are 1 year and 9 days apart. So in that, my story is not uncommon, and I find myself all the time reflecting on how do we get more women in the workforce that understands the complexities of what does it mean to be an Aboriginal woman. Because if I'm going through what I'm going through, I deal with child protection every other week, I deal with all sorts of wonderful things, but it's, it's really important to me. When I received my Order of Australia, somebody said to me at Government House, do you really need to bring your babies? And I went, yeah, actually I do, because for me that's such an important thing. While they might not remember it, they certainly will have a photograph one day of seeing their mum receive this award, because community is leadership. So what do I mean by that? There are lots of, what do I say? So in my job, I'd prefer to be known as an Aboriginal person in a leadership position. And I think that's the really important thing. I'm an Aboriginal person first and foremost. Yes, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a, all of those sorts of things. But it's the complexity of what it means to be an Aboriginal woman for some is quite challenging. There's some days that I want to get up and go, I just want to sit here and rock. Particularly dealing with now 2 little ones who have been gestationally abused by ICE. Drugs are such an important thing. Suicide rates in Aboriginal communities are absolutely the highest that they've ever been. I went to a conference last week and at the Australian Indigenous Rural Leadership Program, and they spoke. There was a young woman who spoke about the suicide rates in the Kimberley, the highest in the world. For not only because the rates are normally around men, young men under the age of 40 taking their lives, but it's now increasingly being heard about women. Also, one of the things that we need to do very much across our workplace is have those policies and procedures that allow for domestic and family violence. It is absolutely critical to have these things in place. And while the rates are, extremely high for women, they are 4 times as high for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. There was a case over the weekend that 2 people died. Aboriginal women died from domestic violence. So if we are going to have true diversity across the sectors, policies and procedures for people like me that are in place, because I think, that sliding door moment, what happens? What would happen if I took that job in the public service, and would they have understood the needs of my family at that particular time? Because it's still ongoing. I don't think so. I probably would have been called in the office and said, we're thinking about letting you go because you're spending too much time with your family. But my workplace that I've created here is something that I'm really proud of. I now have the freedom to do it myself. I don't have to work to a board. I employ, I've got single mums, I've got mums who are working at school holidays, COVID, all those sorts of things. And I think the great thing about what's happened from COVID is that the work where it works strategy. And I think that's absolutely phenomenal that I'm now able to think about how that will work for women. Do you need to come into the office? Working hours have now changed. How many of you were on the emails this morning by about 6 o'clock? They want to admit how many are on the email, in the evening after the kids have gone to bed. So I know that Cara and I were messaging each other the other night. It was about 7:30, 8 o'clock. It's really critical for us to be a bit more fluid and fluid across everything. So I probably got off track, but I hope that I've given you some thoughts about what you might be able to do to include more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within the workplace, particularly women who, like me, some days do it really tough. Some days you just want to cover your head up with a good book, particularly in Canberra, because it's still a minus, or it might be 0 degrees here now, but it's still warming up. But somebody's just bought me a coffee. So if anybody has any questions, happy to answer.
Thanks, Rachelle. There's one question from Corinne, and she just wants to know, is there one thing I can include in my everyday work practice that would make me a better First Nations ally?
Yeah. If you think about, I think about celebrating Aboriginal culture every day. Next week is NAIDOC week. A wonderful theme of NAIDOC week. I'm sure all of your businesses that you work with have got, things happening for NAIDOC week. But I would ask that it should be Aboriginals, it should be embedded in day-to-day practice. It's not just something that is 1 week or Reconciliation Week or Mabo Day. It should be every day. It's about I suppose it requires organisations to truly understand and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, and providing a safe and welcoming environment should be critical to any part of any workplace diversity inclusion strategy. So, there are a lot, we talk about diversity, and it's everything. But there should be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategy in itself. Think about an employment strategy. What does an Aboriginal employment strategy look like? What does an employee value proposition look like? And I'm sure you've all done EVPs, but have you done a specific one that relates to Aboriginal people? An Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander EVP is something that all organisations should do. How do you become a first choice employer rather than an employer of choice? Because there are lots of choices out there. I can tell you as a recruiter at the moment, there are more jobs than there are Aboriginal people. If you go on to Seek at any one time, there's over 2,500 job advertisements just for Aboriginal people. So how do you become an employer of choice? It starts from knowing what you've got right now. What have you got? How would a simple analogy of an Aboriginal person going into a barbecue, and somebody asks them, what do you do? What do you want their response to be? That they're proud to work at this organisation, that they commit to working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a real way, in that there's a safe working environment for them. As I said, there's lots of choices out there, but how do you become the first choice employer? How do you make people want it? It's knowing where you start. Why have people left you? Why have Aboriginal people not working with you anymore? Is it because it wasn't a safe environment? How do you have that safe environment? It's more than cultural awareness training. More than cultural awareness training. It's more than NAIDOC week. It's about asking questions. It's about having real values and standing up for those values. Does that answer the question? Probably not in a sense, but NAIDOC, happy NAIDOC week every one for next week. Remember, it is only a week, and that our practices need to continue daily of respect of Aboriginal culture.